What if the most powerful monarch in Europe spent his final years as a prisoner within his own rotting body? What if the king who defied Rome and reshaped Christianity could not escape the ultimate judgment of mortality? What if Henry VIII, the man who commanded armies and conquered hearts, faced his greatest enemy in the mirror each morning? Today, we explore the devastating decline of England's most infamous ruler. By the end, you will understand how power, paranoia, and physical decay transformed a Renaissance prince into a grotesque shadow of his former glory. The final chapter of Henry's reign reveals not triumph, but a tragic descent into madness, pain, and isolation that would forever change the course of English history. Historical records document a transformation so complete that courtiers barely recognized the giant who once dazzled European courts. The golden athlete who jousted with grace became a bloated tyrant whose very presence struck terror into noble hearts. At number 7, we encounter the pivotal moment that began Henry's physical and psychological destruction. Born from his obsession with knightly glory, the Greenwich Palace tournament of January 24, 1536, marked the beginning of the end for England's warrior king. Contemporary accounts describe Henry thundering down the lists on his destrier, lance couched, when disaster struck with bone-crushing finality. The Duke of Suffolk's lance shattered against the king's visor, sending 2 tons of horse and armored monarch crashing to the frozen ground. Witnesses reported Henry lay unconscious for 2 hours while physicians feared the worst. The accident transformed more than Henry's body. It shattered his confidence and ignited the paranoia that would consume his final decade. Court physicians noted personality changes that modern doctors recognize as symptoms of traumatic brain injury. The consequences rippled through English society as Henry's increasing unpredictability terrorized nobles and commoners alike. At number 6, we witness how a festering wound became Henry's constant tormentor. Medical historians believe the jousting injury developed into a chronic ulcer that refused to heal, possibly complicated by osteomyelitis or diabetes. Palace records document the king's increasing reliance on elaborate mechanical devices to move his massive frame. The royal accounts show payments for specially constructed chairs, pulleys, and even a primitive elevator to transport Henry between the floors of his palaces. Ambassadors reported the overwhelming stench that accompanied the monarch, describing how courtiers fought to avoid positions during audiences downwind. The psychological impact proved even more devastating than the physical agony. Henry, who once prided himself on athletic prowess, now required assistance for the most basic functions. Foreign diplomats wrote detailed accounts of the king's explosive rages when reminded of his limitations. The wound became a symbol of his mortality, driving Henry to increasingly desperate attempts to secure his dynasty before death claimed him. At number 5, we examine how fear consumed the aging monarch's rational judgment. Historical documents reveal a pattern of executions that accelerated dramatically after 1540, as Henry eliminated perceived threats with ruthless efficiency. The execution of Thomas Cromwell in 1540 marked the beginning of a blood-soaked finale to Henry's reign. His former chief minister, the architect of the English Reformation, fell victim to the king's paranoid delusions about loyalty and betrayal. Catherine Howard followed in 1542, beheaded for adultery that may have existed only in Henry's diseased imagination. Henry's nephew, the Earl of Surrey, met the executioner's axe just 9 days before the king's death. Victim of Henry's obsession with eliminating potential threats to his son's succession. Modern historians estimate that Henry ordered more executions in his final 7 years than in the previous 30 combined. The atmosphere at court became suffocating, with nobles walking on eggshells around their increasingly unstable sovereign. These purges revealed a monarch consumed by terror of his own mortality and desperate to control events beyond his grave. At number 4, we confront the horrifying physical metamorphosis that shocked contemporary observers. Armor measurements from the royal armories tell the story in cold steel. Henry's waist expanded from 32 inches in his youth to an astronomical 52 inches by 1546. Venetian ambassador Marino Cavalli described the king in 1546 as of extraordinary corpulence, whose face had become so bloated that his features were barely recognizable. The same man, who had once been called the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on, now required specially reinforced furniture to support his massive bulk. Medical evidence suggests Henry suffered from a combination of conditions, including possible Cushing's syndrome, diabetes, and chronic infections. His famous leg ulcers emitted such a powerful odor that courtiers developed elaborate strategies to avoid proximity to their sovereign. The transformation completed Henry's psychological deterioration. The Golden Prince, who had once embodied Renaissance ideals, now resembled a grotesque caricature of earthly power, corrupted by excess and disease. At number 3, we witness Henry's frantic efforts to secure his dynasty as death approached. The aging king's marriage to Catherine Parr in 1543 represented his final desperate attempt to father additional male heirs. Despite medical evidence that he was likely sterile, court physicians privately doubted Henry's fertility, but none dared voice such treasonous observations. The king's increasing desperation manifested in wild mood swings between hope and despair, as each month passed without news of pregnancy. Palace records document enormous expenditures on fertility treatments, mystic consultations, and religious ceremonies intended to restore Henry's virility. The dynastic crisis drove Henry to increasingly erratic behavior regarding succession planning. He alternately favored and threatened his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, never certain whether bastard children could successfully claim the throne. The Succession Act of 1544 reflected his confusion, establishing a complex hierarchy that satisfied no one. These desperate machinations revealed a king terrified that his life's work would crumble after his death, leaving England vulnerable to civil war and foreign invasion. At number 2, we observe how Henry's final months unfolded in terrible solitude. Contemporary accounts describe a king increasingly cut off from human connection, surrounded by servants too terrified to speak honestly and nobles. Plotting their post-Henry futures, the Act of Attainder against the Howards in January 1547 demonstrated Henry's complete breakdown of trust in those closest to him. Norfolk, his longtime supporter and relative by marriage, faced execution for the crime of quartering royal arms, a charge so trivial it revealed the king's desperate paranoia about loyalty. Physicians noted Henry's deteriorating mental state as he became convinced of conspiracies everywhere. Sleep eluded him as nightmares of betrayal and rebellion haunted his rest. The palace became a prison where the king's word was law, but his judgment had become fatally compromised by pain, medication, and psychological deterioration. Foreign ambassadors reported that Henry spent hours staring at portraits of his deceased son, Edward, perhaps recognizing that his dynasty hung by the slenderest thread. At number 1, we witness the pathetic finale of England's most formidable monarch. Palace records document Henry's final weeks as a nightmare of physical agony and mental anguish that shocked even hardened courtiers accustomed to Tudor brutality. Archbishop Cranmer's account describes finding the king barely conscious, his massive frame racked with fever and infection. The royal physicians, led by Dr. Wendy, administered increasingly desperate treatments, including mercury, opium, and experimental purgatives that likely hastened Henry's demise rather than providing relief. Henry's final coherent act, the signing of Surrey's death warrant on January, and they epitomized the vindictive cruelty that had consumed his final years. Unable to speak clearly due to his swollen tongue and throat, the king communicated through gestures that terrified witnesses described as demonic. When death finally claimed Henry VIII at Whitehall Palace on January 28, 1547, courtiers reportedly felt relief rather than grief. The tyrant who had terrorized England for 38 years had become a prisoner of his own corrupted flesh, dying as he had lived his final years, alone, feared, and consumed by the very power he had wielded so ruthlessly. From the Golden Prince who ascended the throne in 1509 to the grotesque tyrant who died in 1547, Henry VIII's transformation reveals the devastating cost of absolute power corrupted by paranoia and physical decay. The legacy of his final years continues to fascinate historians who recognize in Henry's decline a cautionary tale about the intersection of power, personality, and mortality. History teaches us that even the mightiest monarchs remain vulnerable to the fundamental human condition. That power cannot protect us from pain, paranoia cannot preserve us from death, and isolation ultimately destroys those who choose fear over trust. Henry VIII's tragic finale reminds us that true strength lies not in the ability to inspire fear, but in the wisdom to inspire love and loyalty that outlasts our mortal frames.